John Colvin and Dave Potter talking about the history of Chippenhook, which at one point was really the center of Clarendon. It was the most developed part, for a period. And if you go back over the past 200 to 250 years, any point in time of the history of anything to do with Chippenhook, there's likely a Colvin and/or Potter that was part of it. And so now we have two gentlemen here who have that 250 years worth of history all up here. They've got it, but their families have been part of it for so very, very long, and they're both still in Chippenhook, and now you go through there, it may seem like a sleepy place, but that wasn't always the case. And with that, we'll turn it over to you guys.
You want to? I can just give you a quick view of my position. I think it was like in mid 1700, the first Colvin came into town, Benjamin Colvin, and I didn't understand a lot of this, but I presently live on my piece of land that I bought from my grandparents up in Chippenhook, but it's up on the West Timoth Road. And the strange part about this is, as a child, we always called it Sodom. And my wife gets very upset when I reference Sodom because it really, and I guess it relates back when there used to be a foundry. There was 2 or 3 items of construction, but they claim that the men that worked there, at the end of the week, they take and gamble their money away and go home with no money. And so it was sort of a sad situation. But anyway, so Ben Colvin was one of the first ones to hear. And the neat thing was the property that I purchased, and again, I didn't realize any of this, but at the far end, my property has the Clarendon River going through it. And at the far end, there was an old foundation, and that was Benjamin Colvin's house. And just up the brook from there, he had a son. And the foundation's there. And the other thing that's sort of neat was they dug the trench, and there was a dam another quarter of a mile up the river that crosses on my property, but it's a stone fire place. And they had dug a trench all the way down through, and they must have used the horses with the scoop shovel because it's about yay wide. And sort of, when I first got there, I never realized any of that. So it was sort of interesting to find out that one of the...
When John says trenched, that's an understatement. What Phil measured it, it's like 800 feet long.
I was going to say somewhere between 700 and 800, and it's a causeway that went from the dam and pushed the water over to the mill. And on LiDAR, you can see it quite clearly.
Yeah. But again, it was sort of amazing to come, because if you go to the Beers record, Benjamin Colvin is one of the original people in that thing. So, and the other one was in that area, the Ridlands, and what I've got, and I'm just to leave it with you, and I can't go through it because it's sort of, this is a letter that a guy named John Ridland, who left Clarendon when he was 14 back in 1800. And he came back and he wrote a letter to Miss Keyes. The Keyes lived right in Chippenham, right across from the stone where the old smith, or the blacksmith stone hall. That big 2-story building, that was the Keyes. There was a brother and sister of it there. And this guy had left, and he was a medical doctor in Rhode Island. And he talks about when he was there. So he references a lot of names. He talks about the blacksmith. There was a place that used to make coffins. They used to make pencils. There was 3 or 4 items. So I found, and then 2 or 3 other buildings I always thought that was sort of interesting. And then right in Chippenhook itself, if you come up to Chippenhook, or come up Walker Mountain, come down, there's sort of an oval shape that's in there. You go around either way, go by the fire station. So that was my grandparents' farm. And so when you go across, you bear a left and go around, well, actually, until, I don't know, probably 20 years ago, you come down that hill, right where the ball field is. Across from the ball field, there was the schoolhouse. And my father graduated from that schoolhouse. And then somehow, there was some kind of, I guess the state or whoever owned it was trying to sell it. And you got into a conflict because the land didn't belong to the school district, still belonged to my folks. So they moved it to where the church used to be, where the town hall used to be. It was sort of, they owned that whole circle. And the farm, when I was a kid, my grandmother had a little store in that house. In the front was a store, and she would sell small products, but they'd have kerosene in the back room. And for a while, it was a post office. And I'm a collector of everything. So somewhere I got an envelope stamped with Chippenhook postmark. So I thought that was, a lot of the stuff I didn't realize when I moved back to Chippenhook. But so we were just, but the Kaisers, the Keys, there was the big farm, the big red barn. Debbie Colvin lives right there next to the bridge now. And behind her, that barn, that was the farm for the brother and sister. And there was another house in the corner that's gone, but that's where the pencil manufacturing was. And the big house almost across the street is McGinnis. Is it McGinnis? Anyways, he owned that whole, everything, all the way west Chippenham Road. When I was a kid, he owned everything, that whole corner. Now it's all developed and stuff. And then Mike McCollum, big farm. So I knew most of those people who were part of the history of Chippenhook because it was in the Parker farm, which is the house next to where I live, the brick house. I bought that, I think in 1985. There was two brothers, they were the sons of the farmers, and they were sort of renegades. The old Carl was a drunk and nice guy, but had a tendency to drink. But his brother was sort of set back because of different reasons. So they lived there, and it was just two bachelors living there, and the building was bad. And so he was going to sell it to John Ellis, who lived on the hill, and John was going to tear the building down and put in trailers. And so on Christmas time in 1985, I went home to my wife and I said, "Hon, I just bought you a Christmas present." So anyways, it took me probably a year and a half because I wanted to retain as much of that building as possible, which was the inn. It was sort of interesting because I did a lot of the work in the coloring and stuff. But the inside walls are all brick, solid brick walls. And I've restored a lot of houses. I have never come across a building that the interior walls were brick. And so we rebuilt it. I kept most all of the doors and everything were all originally. We kept the paints and stuff on. Upstairs, the pine boards are this wide. It's just all beautiful stuff. So anyways, then I ended up selling it to a woman who was an airline stewardess, and she came across hard times, I guess, and sold the barn, which killed me because it was a beautiful cattle barn. I was hoping some young kids would come along and want to keep a couple cows or something. Anyway, so I guess that's that's sort of my quick overview of Chippenhook. I spent a lot of time as a kid. I didn't live there. I lived over in Blissville, which is in Castleton area. But my father was, probably every week we came to Chippenhook. And then, because the other thing was, my grandfather had horses. He had, in the barn, in the middle of that big open field, there was a big barn. And on the back side, it was downstairs, he probably had 30, 40 cows, and milk. I always had at least 6 horses, did everything with horses. And then the other thing is up in Chippenhook, or up in Timoth, or Sodom, where I lived, across the road, that was my grandparents as well. As a kid, I used to sugar that whole thing. We used to tap like 2,000 taps, and that was back when you cut the wood in the summertime and boiled, my father boiled, my grandfather and I would gather. It was fun because it was horses. And as I was a kid, we'd just tell the horses to move ahead, turn left, turn right. And the horses would do whatever he told them to do. It was fascinating for his kid to watch something like that. So a lot of history for me that I didn't realize when I moved to Chippenhook. All my ancestors, and there's a ton of them that are buried right in the main Chippenhook Cemetery. They go way back into the early 1700s. So tons of Colvins that are there. So I guess that's, quick overview. That's my relative here with me.
Well, some of his buried relatives are my buried relatives too, if you go back far enough, right? And but I don't know about you guys, but I always like to visit cemeteries because it brings back so much. You see all these names of people, if you've studied history, and this is where they're kind of residing right at the moment. But I'd recommend any of you that don't have the Clarendon history, it's for sale, right? And I think it's the last chapter in the book is about Chippenhook, and it, I wrote it, so I kind of know what's in it, although I reviewed it for tonight, and a lot of it kind of came back to me. But this is a really nice, it was put together by amateurs and published back in Bicentennial Times. And Mill River helped with it, as well as some people that are no longer with us, like Molly King and Elizabeth Hughes and others worked on it. It's a pretty good shot at what's here. It's not obviously complete. But I think the first thing to do would be ask you if you've got any questions. Do you have any area you'd like to have discussed about Chippenhook? And I can try to do it if, yes.
One of the areas is behind the McClellan farm. There's supposed to be kilns up there or something on that hill.
Which farm?
The McClellan
Mike
Mike McClellan's up on the hill behind it. There's something up there, foundations or a kiln. And I was told once, long ago, that was the original Chippenhook before they moved down to capture the water power. So do you know anything about that area out there?
Well, I remember writing about kilns in the area you're talking about. They also mine copperous rocks up on the, from the Quarter Line Road up to the east, it would be. Up on that top, it was supposedly copperous rocks up there. But I think if you talk to call him young Mike McClellan, he's older than I am. He's 78 or something like that now. But his wife just died.
Well, the kid's still there.
But, yeah.
Young Mike's still.
And then he has a son, Eric, that lives up by you and I.
Yeah.
So he would be the best guy to talk to. If it was on the McClellan land, he would obviously know what site, and he would give you a tip about how to
Eric
get
works
there.
for Green Mountain Power.
Yeah, I know where.
Okay, so he's got the truck in the yard.
But I believe it's on the Victory project.
Oh, okay. Tom over up on the hill, on the Quarter Line Road, so I don't think he'd have a problem with it. And young Tom, the other Tom, I don't think they'd have a problem. Either one of them.
So, I think people moved to Chippenham for the same reason they moved to Center Rutland in the early days. There was water power there. And then, is it great farming land around there? Not really. It's not like the flats down here on Otter Creek. Of course, they get flooded sometimes on Otter Creek, but the land is it's the best growing land in Rutland County. The sites in Chippenhook are small. The farms are relatively by today's standards. In the old days, people could make a living there. on the smaller farms. But, you know, there's not a Chippenhook farmer left anymore, a traditional dairy farmer. So it's changed since we were kids, hasn't it? I mean, you know, your grandfather was farming there, my grandfather and uncles were farming there. And there was the Jenks farm.
Dr. Bosky was a farmer.
Yeah, there was
A lot of farm guys when we were kids.
you know, you could have 20 cows and make a living when we were kids, but you can't do that today. I'll just talk about some things that might be of interest to you if you don't have questions. So,
There were 3 dams on the Clarendon River. You know, you look at Clarendon River, it seems so small compared to, say, Otter Creek here, or the Cold River, or even, you know, the Mill River. You know, Clarendon River looks more like a brook. You know, river, a little bit of an overstatement, but there were 3 dams there. One, right where Walker Mountain Road goes over the river, where you had the Ewing Mill, the stone mill that got, you know, torn down some years ago. There was one, like, basically right where the bridge is, but then going another 100 feet or so, 200 feet south on the river, at a little bit higher elevation, there was a dam there because there was, you know, most people remember the stone mill. They got torn down in more recent times. But we have pictures on our website. There were 2 other mills directly across the road. One of them was also stone, you know, it's entirely gone, and there was another mill also entirely gone. But the abutments are still there for a dam that was feeding. So the 2 dams basically fed the 3 mills. And then you have the Colvin dams on the mill that John was talking about, you know, deeper in the woods, you know, further to the south. But that, you know, little stream was supporting an awful lot of activity.
Well, actually, across the river from me is what they call Blue Horizon. And when I was a kid, that was a campground. And right there, there's a dam, there's a big pond that the campers used to use. It's right behind John Ellis. If you go where John Ellis lives now, behind him, there's a big dam where, as I say, that whole area was a campground. You get on Blue Horizon and you bear right, the first house is where the owners, they used to run it. And on the left, there was a big old barn. And they converted that into a house. And I think Jim Doherty and Don, who now moved to Texas, Bob Stimson, who was a contractor, rebuilt that into a house and they lived there. But it was a big campground. It's all been developed now with houses.
Did the campground have, separate from the pool, if you will, on the river, was there a separate pool there? That's one of the things I've been unsure of.
No, I've never seen anything. There's a swimming hole behind the house. And it's just a natural thing.
Okay. Because I had come across an account of, I guess, a couple guys from Rutland being hired to build a pool. But it was unclear, was it like a swimming pool you put in your backyard, or is it creating something down on the river?
Yeah.
they created something down the pool that he's talking about. It was kind of a pond. We used to call it McGee's Pond.
Yeah.
And I caught trout in there. I don't know about you, but
Yeah, they got the keys. They were the guys that had started the Blue Horizon camp, the husband and wife.
while we're on that neck of the woods, there was a iron foundry right in that location. It would be just north of the bridge that goes across New Horizons. And they made stoves there, different kinds of stoves, you know, parlor stoves and that sort of thing. And it was Noah Shepherdson that started that. He was an ancestor of Elizabeth Hughes. Anybody that grew up down on the flats, I know the Congdons would remember her. And it was one of her ancestors. And let's see, I have the dates that he was working there. And then there was another iron foundry up just over the line in Tinmouth, but on the Clarendon River, operating around the same time. I think it started in 78, something like that, 1798, and went for a time into the early 1800s. And there's still slag there, you know, you can see evidence of it quite clearly.
The other thing in that area, if you go up, I guess it's actually in Timoth, but at Crossroads, as you head in Clarendon River, what comes out of the Timoth Channel, the power company had started the dam. They were going to flood that whole Timoth Channel. And if you go by there, you can still see the cement poured. Because in the back in the 20s and 30s, all the electric utilities were going around the state buying up riparian rights and property outlets of all of these little brooks. And so up there, it's quite a concrete area that's been developed, just sitting there. But I think they realized that they were going to kill so much natural life if they ever flooded the swamps up there. Because the Timoth Channel is a massive, massive area. And it's
1,000 acres.
Yeah, it's massive. So, but that was, you know, another one of the utilities that they bought everything and never materialized it. And actually, they just started selling the land for like
Yeah, I bought a chunk of it.
yeah, they just probably what 15 years ago.
Oh, it was more than that.
20 years ago. But anyways,
Yeah.
they own all of the land coming right
It was
down.
about
the channel.
35 years ago.
No, it couldn't have been that long.
That's how time goes.
Mike just
It was 84, 85 when they sold that.
anyways, I mean, they bought a lot of, the utilities own a tremendous amount of
Yeah,
land.
Hortonia Light and Power
Yeah.
owned that, and then they went bankrupt, and then CV bought it.
CV consisted of, I think, of 120 some odd small utilities.
I think for modern times, they didn't have the flowage there.
No.
They didn't have enough water to
Didn't have-
justify making the
They call it a
investment.
head, not enough head to.
Yeah, there wasn't enough head there to justify a capital investment they'd have had to make. But, yes,
I also read regarding that whole project, that the people that lived in that area were protesting because what they were afraid of is all of that flooding was going to create diseases and things
Yeah.
from the mosquitoes and all that. So they were really concerned with what other things might happen.
they had a dam there in the early 1800s. They had a dam that flooded all of Timoth Channel, and there was a lot of resistance around, you know, they didn't have the health care that they have today, and so they blamed a lot on the insects that were causing problems. And there was actually 2 iron foundries, one below that bridge, that would have been north, just over the Timoth line in Clarendon and then into Timoth. And then there was another foundry on the south side of the bridge early on too. And they mined the ore in Timoth, the iron ore. I suspect that that's where they used the ore down at Noah Shepherdson's place at New Horizons too. But I don't know that for sure, but I know that they, you know, Henry showed me, Henry Potter, who sold me the land that I live on now. He showed me where they mined the iron up in Timoth. And when I blasted for my foundation, it was full of iron in the rocks that were, you know, apparently it's on the same grade, the same level that the iron ore is that they mined up there. John mentioned the church in Hull. I remember that, you know, as a young man. I helped paint it one time in the late 60s, and it was burned by arson in the early 70s. 71, I think it was, that it was burned. And then the school got moved over there. And it was kind of, as a kid, I remember it was defunct. You know, they weren't having church services there. And I think it was kind of like that, you know, throughout the 1900s. It was first built in 1798, and then it was added to, and they built an upstairs into the thing. They divided it into an upstairs and a downstairs. They had church upstairs, and then they had, more social, sort of like, how churches will have a social room for dinners and things like that. And that's how that building was divided similarly. And as I remember it as a kid, it just wasn't used much. They'd open it up maybe for a church service or something 1 or 2 times in the summer, and that was it. But in the 30s and 40s, when my uncles and father were young, they had box socials there and dances, and I gave a couple of things to the Historical Society that were advertising. What are they called, broadheads or something like that. And so it was very active, and it was historically a Baptist church that was among the oldest in Vermont. It had historical significance. It's unfortunate that it got burned. There's, in the book here, it's kind of neat. It shows the people that contributed to getting the church started. It must be my ancestors weren't too religious because they're not on there. I don't know if there's a Colvin there either. I don't think so.
They're cheap. Colvins were cheap.
Yeah, Potters were too. Anyway, that's one thing. And another one, while we're talking about, the mill in Chippenhook, this is it. And you saw pictures of it when I passed around the book. And that was, a big mill. And it was started in 1830, I think it was.
It was one of the original businesses in town.
Yeah,
Ewing's.
it was started from the silk. There were Julius Ewing.
Yeah, the Ewing.
The Ewings lived in Chippenhook, and he apparently had some capital, and he's the one that built that in 1830. Had an Ira Mason build it, and I sort of hate to admit it, but when I was on the select board in Clarendon, we voted to tear it down. The town then ended up owning it because it went up for tax sale and nobody bid on it. And it was, it was just a lure for people to go in there. And there was a liability to the town that we were concerned about. And so we had it knocked down. And I hated to do it because I knew the significance of it historically, but it was the right thing to do for this generation and future generations, in my mind anyway.
The Julius Ewing he just mentioned on the table right in front of you, Dave.
Yeah.
Julius Ewing was the town treasurer at one point, and that's his ledger book when he was the town treasurer. And that book covers more than just his tenure, but it was 1820 to 1853. And somehow it made its way to San Diego, and one of the Ewing descendants out there gave it to us about a month ago.
Yeah.
That's
Sitting up there
pretty
at the
neat.
table. That book is from.
Yeah.
And so Julius Ewing eventually sold it, and the Kais bought it. The Kais lived in, if you're coming from Walker Mountain Road by the Creek Road, and you take a left right by the ball field, and then you go across the bridge. They were the first farm on the left. They also had a gravel pit, and their gravel pit furnished much of the gravel for leveling the airport road, the airport runway. But the Kaises bought that mill, and then they operated a grist mill and a cider mill there for like 50 years, a long time. And the Kaises, it mentions in the book here, Alice Kais, who we were talking about a little earlier, she remembered as a young girl that her father had a sawmill and it burned. It went up for some reason. It's easy for mills to burn because there's a lot of combustible stuff, usually sawdust and things like that, that can get going easily. And like John said, they had a coffin factory there. Across the way, on the other side of the river, just above the bridge, at one time there was a spring there, and apparently Chippenhook thought maybe that they could get maybe economically a little more active by involving that spring. And there actually is a postmark. John mentioned a Chippenhook postmark. They're quite rare, but what's really rare is a Chippenhook Springs. They actually had a postmark, Chippenhook Springs, for a couple of years, and it's one of the rarest postmarks that you can get in Vermont. And he isn't here tonight, but who's the fellow that goes around with the walker now that was here last meeting that sells? McMorrow. I was at Rutland Fair back a number of years ago, probably 25, 30, and they used to have a stamp exhibit. And I remember seeing one of McMorrow's, he would create a different stamp exhibit each year for the fair, and I always was attracted to it. And guess what? He had a Chippenhook Springs stamp postmark on there, and I'll see him in the post office, and I'll say, "You want to sell that?" You know, and I'd buy it for the Historical Society. And if you have a connection to him, you see if you can get. You know, he has a lot of stuff, and he doesn't know where it is, and if you can get him to look for it.
I've been buying Clarendon postcards from him for the past couple of years.
Well, there you go.
Every time I find one.
I've asked him to see if he can find that, and of course he may have sold it. I don't know, you know.
In
but
business.
I would be willing to buy it and donate it to the historical. I have all the other post offices stamps for them, including several of Chippenhook, that I would be glad to give to you for the Historical Society.
Commercial business, Chippenhook Springs, was I think in the 1870s. You know, it got great publicity, and it was going to be the next great thing.
Yeah.
And, you know,
John mentioned the blacksmith shop across from Dan Kaiser's, where he lived, and he said he could remember going there as a kid, and they had a sling that was big enough to go under an oxen and lift that oxen up in order to put shoes on it in that blacksmith shop. So, and then there were several cheese factories in Chippenhook. The biggest one was ran by one of the Walkers, and the Walkers lived where at least the last Walker that we know of lived where Mrs. Royce, which is right at the corner of East Tinmouth Road and Walker Mountain Road. That's where Walker lived, and he was one of the pioneers, and you know, they aptly named Walker Mountain Road after him. And in Chippenhook Cemetery, I'll bet you there's a dozen gravestones of Walkers that are, you know, they're all buried kind of close together. And they were obviously a prosperous, very, entrepreneuring family. And it says they had a cheese factory that made 50,000 pounds of cheese in a year, and they had 200 cows that supplied the milk for it. Now, where that exactly was, I don't know. I'm assuming it was probably, you know, right up the hill here, or over Chippenhook, right up the hill by the house somewhere, but I don't know that for sure. And then Siemens had they're another Chippenhook name, and they had a cheese factory. And Westcott's, which lived on the La Victory farm, the brick house there right across from La Victory's used cars. That was the Westcott farm, and they had a cheese factory in the early 1900s. And Alice guys could remember going there with her father and getting a taste of the curds that were being made there. Alice Kais was a wonderful woman. I only knew her in her old age, and she was really, really helpful in providing a lot of information to do the Chippenhook history that's in this book. I want to give her credit for that. She was a great lady, and Dan Kais was he had a sense of humor. You know, And he was good friends with the old Potters in Chippenhook. For some reason, you know, they were just good neighbors and friendly. I remember he had the first chainsaw I ever saw in use. And I gave a picture of it to the Historical Society. And he came up to the Potter farm. This would have been, I was probably about a senior in high school. Ed and I were in school together. It would have been about the time we were in the end of high school, which would have been like 61 or 2 or something like that. And, you know, that was quite a thing to see a chainsaw working when, you know, the first tree I ever cut was with a cross-cut saw and an axe. You know, that's what we were using. And then we used belt table saws to cut limbs up and stuff for firewood. And, you know, we did a lot of splitting by hand. They didn't have splitters. Hydraulics weren't invented then. And so times have changed a lot. You guys know about Judge Theophilus Harrington? Anyway, he was probably Chippenhook's most famous person. And he went into law, but he was never formally educated as a lawyer. He was just a kind of a rough, tough farmer, kind of a burly guy. And it's said that in court, he would look like he was asleep and with his eyes closed and stuff while testimony was going on. But when it came time to charge the jury, he could remember great detail, you know, from what was said and be able to recite back what had gone on and so forth and the expectations that a court has. And he made a very famous decision, and it happened, I don't know if any of you know, but the original county seat in Rutland County was not in Rutland. You would think it would be, but it wasn't. Guess where it was? It was right up the road from the East Teignmouth Road in Teignmouth. And they had the courthouse there and the jail. I don't believe there's evidence that they're there today. Maybe they're foundations or something. But the courthouse and the jail were there. So, you know, there was Judge Increase Mosley from Chippenhook that went up there to be a judge. And there was Theophilus Harrington, who was from Clarendon Springs area, went up there to serve as a judge. And in one of his very famous rulings, he had a slave come before him, and the owner was a runaway slave, and the owner was trying to get him back. And so the owner presented his preliminary evidence, and that wasn't good enough. It was inconclusive. And so he added some more evidence and gave it a second try, and still no dice from the judge. And so finally, you know, in desperation, the lawyer for the claimant of the slave said, well, Your Honor, what would be needed to show ownership of this slave? And Judge Theophilus Harrington said, a bill straight from God Almighty. And so, as you might imagine, something like that made the national news. And Vermont, of course, had in its constitution that there would be no slavery. And so his judgment, his case, reinforced Vermont's, you know, attitude towards slavery and gave him a sort of a national as well as a statewide reputation. And then he went on, he was represented Clarendon in the legislature in 1795, and then from like 1798 to 1803. And in 1803, he was Speaker of the Vermont House. And so, you know, he had gained quite a reputation in the state. And at that point, in 1803, he was appointed to be a Supreme Court Associate Justice. And he had that job for 10 years until his death. I think he died in 1813. And he's buried in Chippenhook Cemetery. And you'll see it's the largest monument in Chippenhook Cemetery. It's kind of a needle-shaped monument, tallest one in the cemetery. And that monument was paid for by the Vermont legislature. In something like 1880, a number of years after he died, they erected this monument, and it cost $400, but there was an appropriation from the Vermont legislature to put up that monument for him. The other most famous person probably from Chippenhook was Increase Mosley. And Increase Mosley married the widow Potter. Widow Potter was the wife of Captain Oliver Potter, who was one of the very earliest people to come to Chippenhook. And he died up in the Battle of Montreal, not from wounds, but from smallpox. He was part of the expedition that went to Canada during the Revolution. And so he had a wife that was left, and she remarried Increase Mosley. And Increase Mosley also was a Rutland County judge and for a number of years. And he went on, he was a legislator as well, and he went on to become chair of the Vermont Council of Censors, which we don't have today. They don't exist, but in those days they were meant to act as a check and a balance to the crazy things the legislature does sometimes. Anyway, Increase Mosley was chair of that committee, you might say, for a period of time. I think, I don't know, maybe you remember when they got sent out of existence, but it was in the it was in the middle to early, probably 1830 or something like that, that they went out of business. They weren't needed anymore. But it was an honor, I'm sure, to be chosen as the chair of that group. Do you have any questions about any of those kind of people? I mean, they just were trying to make a living like all of us try to do, and it must have been pretty tough sometimes coming here in those days. Life was simpler, but I'm sure it was hard.
What about the early roads? Was it like West Timoth Road running north and south, or what can you tell me?
As far as I know, I don't know too much specifics about that, but I know Timoth, back here since I've been in the legislature, we had to deal with it. They caused towns to have to make a decision about what roads they were going to keep and what roads they weren't going to keep, because it was creating a lot of land controversy. You would know as an attorney that you could get in a sticky wicket pretty easy. And so this law that we made forced towns to decide on a map which roads they wanted to keep because they were important to the town, and which roads going way back in history were meaningless now. And we gave them like 2 or 3 years to figure it out. And anyway, Timoth had a road that went through my property. And so they talked to me about it. I didn't even know it existed. So it wasn't like any skin off my back that they were going to throw it up. In fact, I was glad they were going to throw it up. So, that was an example of a road. And, there was another road that runs up through Pete's Notch. We call it Pete's Notch. That was like Peter Parker lived up there in that notch that's south of Susie's Peak. It's actually kind of more in Timoth than it is in Clarendon. And Peter Parker lived there. And Peter Parker was a character. Every town had to have a character or two. And supposedly Peter Parker got into a sword duel with a British officer, and he lopped that British officer's head off, and it rolled down into a little depression, and it was facing up. And after he'd done that, the head said to him, "Well done, Sir Peter Parker." And so that's the story of Peter Parker. Fortunately, I'm not related to him. Maybe John is. And then there were the Fisks. They lived right near where John lives, and the Colvins, right across the road actually from the Colvins. And Fisk owned that New Horizons. They used to own down in there over on the Hall Hill in that area. And they were, I'm sure, farmers and carpenters. And my mother was a Fisk, so I'm descended from that group of people. And they, you know, like the barn at Bonazingas, across the road from Dr. Bonazingas on the East Tinmouth Road, that was built by the Fisks. And part of the barn the Potters had on the Potter farm, that was built by the Fisks. And I'm sure, you know, they just made a living as carpenters, many of them. And I brought the first Fisk was Benjamin Fisk. He's buried in Chippenhook Cemetery along with all of his descendants, including my grandfather and grandmother. My grandfather was a medical doctor. But anyway, this is the gun that Benjamin Fisk had. You know, he was one of the original settlers in Danby and then moved up to Chippenham. If any of you want to look at that. It blew up and there's a patch here. If you look, you can see the patch right where the patches were right here. So I don't think it's fireable now. I don't think anybody would want to do it, but you know, it's a neat example of, you know, how rifles used to be back in colonial days. And then I brought, there's actually been a couple Noel Potters. My father's name was Noel Potter. My great-grandfather's name was Noel Potter. And it would be his grandfather, so what's that? Three or four greats were Noel Potters. It's sort of a family name. And so this Noel Potter, he was one of the first settlers in Chippenhook, and he moved out to into New York State. And this is a pension paper where he got a pension for serving in the Revolutionary War. He's not buried in Chippenhook Cemetery. He's buried out in New York. I think he went there probably late in his life to live with one of his sons or daughters. But if you've never seen a pension paper, that's what one looks like. The Potters are confusing. You know, it's been difficult to sort it out genealogically because a Potter married a Potter at my great-grandmother and grandfather's level. And, but they weren't closely related, but they had the same last name, and it makes things confusing.
Yeah, there were 3 or 4 Potter settlers. They weren't particularly closely related. Maybe 2 of them were like second or third cousins.
Yeah.
The others weren't closely related. So they come here and they didn't say, okay, we'll use these first names and you use those first names. So, you know, you get the same first name appearing, Henrys and Lewis's, you know, let alone how many people were named Noel. And so personally, I've had to create, you know, an Excel spreadsheet of the Potters. So when one comes up, a picture or something, I can keep them straight. Which Potter clan were they? Are they the West Tinmouth Potters or the East Tinmouth Potters? Or those other Potters, you know, that kind of came and went? But it's a confusing clan.
It is.
Sure. Especially when they started marrying each other.
And then there's a David Potter who is buried in Chippenhook Cemetery. He's a Revolutionary War soldier, and I'm descended from him. And I went there with my grandfather when I was just a little tyke, about 5 or 6. And my grandfather, of course, you know, with great pride, was saying, oh, this is David Potter's grave. He's your great-great-great-grandfather. And he was a Revolutionary War soldier. And I'll listen. And I allegedly said to him, you mean I died before I was born? So I was always thinking, even in those days. But so David Potter is actually buried in Chippenhook Cemetery, and he served in the Revolution down in Connecticut, down in Rhode Island. That's where the Potters came from. So those were he was the line that carried into the East Teignmouth Road potters. And the Knoll Potter line carried into the West Teignmouth Road potters. And I actually live on a 200-year family farm. The farm that I live on, the very land I live on, has been in my family 200 years. And I'm very proud of that. And it's pretty neat. And potters have been here. There's a death certificate for Abel Potter, who was the father of this David Potter I just talked about, in 1780 in the Clarendon town records. He's probably one of the oldest death certificates, if not the oldest, in the town records. And I don't know where he's buried. I've never seen I've never seen any memorial for him. He may have been buried in an unmarked grave in 1780. It would be pretty easy. I don't even know if Chippenhook Cemetery was going then, or if he lived in Chippenhook. It just says he died, Abel Potter, 1780, father of David Potter. Might not even be buried in Vermont, I don't know, but I don't think they'd have a Clarendon death certificate if he wasn't buried in the town.
Dave, is there a connection between the Potters and the Madsons and the Madsen Cemetery?
In the what? Which one?
Is it Madsen?
Madison? No. The Madisons owned the land where the Potter farm is on the West Teignmouth Road prior to when the Potters did. The Potters bought that farm in 1840. That was a different line, remember? And, I have joined those two farms now. I think I've made 6 land purchases in my life. And so I own 990 acres. Most of it is forest land. Maybe 150 acres is agricultural land. And, I try to make it pay. Try to make it pay the taxes, and so I'm not losing money on it. But I'm not getting rich off it either. But, I have great sentimentality to it because I worked on, that West Teignmouth Road farm with my uncles, and, hunted with them. And, I have great sentimental attachment to that property. That wasn't the first property I was able to buy. I was able to buy the Henry Potter farm, which was a distant cousin. But he didn't have any children. And so he wanted to keep it in the Potter name, the Potter family. So he was kind enough to sell it to me. I never got any land free, but I didn't always have to pay the long price to get it. My family was good to me. And anyway, I put together in different stages. I've joined 2 family farms plus some extra land around the family farm, including part of it from CV, PS 150 acres.
The name Noel Potter was not just popular in the Potter family, because you had mentioned earlier Dr. Ridlum, who is deemed the father of orthopedic surgery in the country. He became quite famous in his day. But I'm going on memory here, but I think Dr. Ridlum's father's name was Noel Potter Ridlum. That he Noel for Potter for a middle name.
Yeah.
Well,
the Noel Potters were that popular.
I know the Ridlums and the Fisks. The Ridlums and the Fisks married at one point. And if you think about it, John and I were talking about it earlier, you didn't have a lot of choice before cars came along, did you? I mean, you had to marry the girl next door almost. It was that, maybe a little ways further with a horse, but, my grandfather married the girl over the mountain in Ira. I don't know how he got there, whether he'd go over Susie's Peak to get to see her, or whether he took a horse out around the other way. But anyway. So when I ran for office in Ira, it was really helpful. I would tell people, I'd say, I live just like you, except over the mountain. And it's true. And so it was a way to identify with a rural community.
Yeah, some of the Potters are buried over in Ira.
Yeah, there is another Potter family over there, and I think I'm related to them distantly, but not closely. There was Isaac Tubbs, and he lived on the East Tinmouth Road. He was a very early settler on what was the Raish Farm, and he had a tannery, and for like 40 years he made leather there on what was the Raish Farm. It's all subdivided now. And supposedly they won the lottery way back then, and they got a slug of money, and they built a mausoleum. But the roof is all rotted away, and so, you know, it's sort of a mausoleum without a roof, and they're buried there, right on the Raish Farm, the early Tubbs.
And we're related to the Tubbs.
Yeah,
Colvin's married into the Tubbs.
and
So they're,
and the Kaisers were related to the Tubbs and the Hills also.
Maybe was that the snowshoes and stuff, would that be any relation, was it their Tubbs snowshoes or something?
yeah, but I think they're out of Brandon. I don't know whether it would be a child of the original Tubbs, because, you know, the original Tubbs were all farmers.
And another business not mentioned is sort of across from where, you know, John lives on West Tinmouth Road, was a marble quarry that the Barnes family owned. They were out of Rutland, West Rutland.
I
Yeah,
got a
they
picture
were
of
out
that
of West
farm.
Rutland.
There's a farm that's down, actually, I think Ami owns it, and
Yeah.
actually, a neighbor just bought the house, but up behind this is an old painting that I got, and it shows the farm, and you look up in the back and you can see where the quarry, because if you go up behind, like Dave's place, there's a big quarry up there, and a lot of big hunks of marble where they started digging, and the quality must have been poor, so it never was fully materialized. But this is the farm, and when I first moved up to Chippenhook, this barn was still in place. And the bottom of it is all, just like the ones up on the changing station, the 8 foot of it is all stone, little stones all, and then the rest is wood. But,
Is that the one on the Jenks farm?
Yeah, that would be the Jigs Farm.
well, the Victory's, actually Tom LaVictory lived there, and then this place burnt, and then,
La Victory's moved in there.
moved in.
Yeah. Down at the other house.
But, well, Tomo lived in the house next door to me where Marilyn.
Yeah,
But he also lived at the farm. He had a small farm there for a while.
yeah, but I think he was living in that house down by you.
Yeah. But I thought it was sort of an interesting, because this is way back.
I remember when that house burned and
Huh?
George,
We would love to scan that, that's a picture.
I brought that for you.
Oh,
And then,
Euro.
and the other thing I brought is this, I've got just, this is an ad back in 1882, and it's for supper on the flats. And so it's sort of interesting. Again, I'll leave that with you. It just sort of, because, you know, the cost and just the words that they use to advertise is sort of interesting.
Is that an oyster supper?
No,
It was
The
in-
reason I say that,
yeah,
I
I've
found
heard that.
in the diaries,
Oh,
they
yeah.
had a lot of oyster
Yeah.
suppers in the 1800s, which seemed to be an odd, I suppose it came in on the train and stayed fresh.
There was an incredible amount of civic engagement
Oh, yeah.
in those days. You had, you know, the local groups putting on plays and concerts, and you had just all sorts of clubs, garden clubs and homemaker clubs, and, you know, you had the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and, you know, different troops at different times, and just lots of that. all over that
it was
they-
before television and
Yeah, these
computers.
things just don't exist
And so
anymore.
people socialized with home dem and things like that.
Right, the
Alice
communities
Kaiser
were
was in
engaged
home
with
dem.
each other at a social level.
And
In a ledger book there, it's right in front of you, the Fish and Game Club.
yeah, they had a fishing game club. I remember that when that house burned that you're talking about, and George Jenks lived there, and he was a farmer. He was built like a fire plug, you know, and he had red hair, and You know, apparently he didn't have a lot of patience because, and of course, the roads weren't kept quite the same way they are today. And even though people complain today, the roads weren't anywhere near, you know, they had like 2 guys on the road crew. There was Carl Lanfear, the road commissioner, and then there was Mike McClellan, the guy that ran the truck over on the east side of town, and Carl Lanfear drove the grader on this side of town, and that's how snow got off. You can imagine it took them a while. And so anyway, the fire truck couldn't get up there because the road wasn't the way it is today. And George Jenks hauled off and leathered one of the firemen from West Rutland. Clarendon didn't have a fire department, you know, it came out of West Rutland. And so he punched one of the firemen from West Rutland. I remember that, you know, you can remember stuff like that.
Right.
I was probably not in high school even. I was probably, you know, junior high age or something like that.
Any other areas, or that's probably enough conversation?
How did Chippenhook get its name?
Well, nobody knows.
Okay.
I heard, and I can't remember now, it was something to do with the fishing in the river. There was some, and I can't even remember who told me that. Because I'm always asking the same thing, and it's Chip Hook, and it had something to do with fishing in the Clarendon River.
Well, Hook also has a Dutch derivation, which means place. And so some people thought, you know, maybe, you know, nobody knows of a Chippen that was in Chippenhook, but, you know, the Dutch word hook means place. And so that's maybe one possible derivation. And there was another one that it talks about in the history here. I forget what it is, but it's in the early part of the write-up on Clarendon.
But it was pretty easy in the old days to come up with. Everybody started using, it's like where I live, it's Sodom. You know, it's like nobody other than myself probably even knows what's
No, Potter's talked about Sodom, so
Yeah,
it was
I mean, it's a point
Yeah.
that you don't want to talk about, but it gets, and I've asked for years, and the only thing I ever heard was the guy used to gamble their money away. Whether that's true or not, I have no idea, but it's a strange, it comes from the Bible, but it was a bad place, and it's like, I think it's a wonderful place.
I think there was a lot of heavy drinking involved.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that combination of gambling and drinking.
I'm trying to keep that up.
And there's one account I saw dealing with an angry wife over the drinking. And, you know, go back to Sodom and come back when you're sober.
Yeah.
There is one other thing that's of interest on just beyond the Potter farm, almost on the Teignmouth line, on the left, right across from the Potter's Long Meadow there, was a pasture. I used to go get the cows there because the Potters rented it for like 50 years from CV. And there's a little hill in the middle of that pasture. It's got a beautiful view looking out over Teignmouth Channel. And the Greens lived there in the early days. And this guy by the name of Darius Green supposedly flew an early flying machine off that hill. And, you know, I haven't got the cows there. You know, it was a natural place to try to do something like that. Anyway, there was a poem drafted as a result of that effort. Apparently it was quite well known that this guy made it was in the 1800s, so it wasn't successful, as you might imagine. And he ended up piled up and didn't get hurt real bad. But he made an early attempt at flying, and then there was this poem about Darius Green and his flying machine. And, you know, you could say, well, it was all just kind of poetry or somebody's imagination, but I had once, back in the 50s, I saw on a Forest Service map of the area, Rutland County area, it identified the site of Darius Green and his flying machine on that map. So there had to be some substance to it. And I have a copy of the poem. I looked for it a little bit before I came today, but I couldn't find it. I couldn't put my hand right on it. I know I have it. But anyway, there was an early attempt at flight off the Green Hill in, I don't know if it would be considered in Teignmouth or in Clarendon, right about on the line. Probably in Clarendon.
Going back to the question about where did Chippenhook get its name, the other mystery in that area is the mountain with two names, Edmonds Peak and Susie's Peak,
And Pitcher Peak.
and Pitcher Peak.
Yeah, it's got about 3 names.
Yeah, Susie Pitcher is what, you know, the fourth version of it.
Our family always called it Pitcher Peak, but I think the most common name today is Susie's Peak.
No definition working. I have no clue.
There was an Edmonds family in Chippenhook.
Yeah, one's buried, he's a Revolutionary War soldier buried right across from, he's right by Eric McClellan.
And I believe on the state maps and things, it's labeled Edmonds, not Susie.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
geologic survey maps call it Edmonds Peak.
I put a flag on his grave every year. He's a family plot there.
That's it.
Okay, well, thank you guys.